Okay, we are live. Welcome back, party people, for another DAOhaus Haus Party live. Thank you for joining us. This week we got Bill Warren as a guest, so welcome to Bill. Which is weird to say because you're our first sort of like inside the house, but let's talk about the house. You're a member of HausDAO, so in a sense you're not a guest. But I said, come be here for this specifically because you're not always here.
No.
So we can talk about, in a way, talk about lawyer things. But we will get to that in a moment. First up is housework updates. Anything cool? I'm working on a post that'll drop this Friday that kind of like is Mage Smith overlap this time. Just talking about game design and influence inside of what we're building with some graphics and stuff, some teases. So check that out. Otherwise, kind of what are you guys working on the product side?
Well, you put in a feature request this morning for a random theme generator that's now I'm putting aside all my important work for.
Right. The pitch was we should have an Instagram account where we just send out a screenshot of like randomly composed from a set of variables, like a fake DAO theme profile, and see what comes out.
Are we going to use a Chainlink oracle to generate the random theme?
Yes, please.
Oh, geez, I didn't mean to start a fight about if true randomness is possible.
Yeah.
No, I want to use the Uniswap oracle.
RNG on XDAI too.
Yeah.
I'll drop a little alpha leak here if I can stream. Working on some sweet charts.
Ooh, sexy.
Adding some gradients. Ooh, that doesn't really work. Here we go. There's nothing in the past.
Quick down 9,000. Hal down 9,000.
Having trouble with the 1 month still.
Here, let's brighten it up real quick.
Anybody want to check on the feed and let me know if it's working? I can't check it without janking up. I can see it all the way up to the pipeline, but I don't know that it's landing properly. Talk to me in the chat. That'll be a fun test. No one ever talks in the chat, and that's okay. Sweet.
Yeah, that looks great.
That's a sexy.
We're also doing some stuff with minions. We'll have probably a really vanilla minion set up for the new app. Bill actually is getting some stuff working around that, and we'll have even more cool ways to use the minion soon. Whoa, Yearn. Is that the Yearn NFT?
Yes, the Yearn theme NFT.
Have to be a whole coiner to get it.
Definitely. Okay.
That looks cool.
Just code.
Sweet. Yeah, so otherwise, building that stuff so people can use it ultimately. And I think there's overlap with comms and community space. We're figuring out how we can get users in there and kind of have a feedback, system. Get some of our stakeholders involved, helping us battle test the stuff you were just playing with. So that's cool. And yeah, I think digging in on the battle test piece gets us to tokenomics a little bit, which is, just ultimately we've been trying to figure out how to incentivize these things within a system like this. We have other things to play with other than just, hey, here's an Amazon gift card for doing a user interview like, Stripe does to me at least once a year, right? Or whatever. Stripe, sometimes it's Adobe. That's kind of been the alchemist conversation. And also just looking at, again, what does a DAO of DAOs look like? What does it look like when organizations want to cooperate with one another rather than just sort of have people who overlap? Interlinking incentive mechanisms immediately spins off into a whole almost philosophical conversation.
Partnerships are tough, especially when there's money involved. Money and people make things complicated.
But yeah, I guess to wrap up the updates, unless anybody else has anything else to throw out, I think we got some pretty cool stuff coming in the next couple weeks, which means it's quiet in the house a little bit in terms of what we have to tell you.
Yeah, we're all just working in the basement.
Yeah, exactly. But
Our respective caves.
I'm trying to think what sticks to like the house party metaphor. Like, I don't know, mixing up the jungle juice in the basement or something. Party's on, bros.
Brewing up her bathtub, Jen.
Yeah, right. Word. Cool. I mean, that gets us to the sort of the panel and whatever podcast, whatever this is, part of this, where we just kind of riff on a topic each week. Last week's was great with Leo from Machi X talking about NFTs and stuff. And like I said, this week we got Bill from within the house, but like most of us, also from without. We met through LexDAO, I think.
Yep.
You two are a reformed attorney in a sense, although more lawyer than me. You took the bar and practiced and stuff. I took a look at the bar and went, nope, I'm gonna go over here and build software.
Yeah,
but otherwise, like, what's the rest of how do you find yourself in the house, so to speak?
Yeah. I mean, I loved DAOhaus from the first time I saw it. Like it was probably last like August or September when the Odyssey guys put it out after ETH Berlin, and I created BuildDAO pretty immediately.
That.
Yeah, nobody else joined. I'm the only Bill in the Ethereum ecosystem. I feel like Alex DAO and
James.
James DAO. Those got more traction. But
yeah, you gotta have a yoga. You gotta have a yoga sesh like James DAO did. How they really got roped into.
Yeah. But I've been like into the DAO space for a while. When we started the startup I work on, Peeps Democracy, over 2 years ago, we were focused on creating mostly like DAOs for politics and social action and stuff like that. But we're kind of like straddling that Web 2, Web 3 space. And then after a certain point, just decided to like jump into Web 3 because you can just do so much more. And even though Web 3 we're kind of like on the early end, it's exciting to be early and like having these mechanisms that you can execute through smart contracts to really coordinate people and resources in completely new ways that, right, if you tried to do it in the Web 2 space, you have to have like a payment processor and probably like some sort of banking partnership and all of these other things that make it hard and pretty expensive for people to coordinate across space and time. And that's all pretty well solved by smart contracts. The challenge now is just onboarding people to Ethereum and helping them realize like, hey, there's this really powerful tool called a DAO, and there's this really cool tool called DAOhaus where you can launch it with a couple of buttons and then interact with it through what will be an amazing UI.
Was Scott was asking if you were part of Yang DAO.
Yeah, I was part of Yang DAO. That was one of the first DAOs I joined, I think, officially.
That was the first one we did that. I mean, it was still like a one-off kind of thing. We had done Metacartel and then we did Yang DAO.
Yeah.
It was like an attempt to get more like normies in, but still needed some work.
Which was ultimately a fundraising effort for Andrew Yang.
Yeah, for making
memes.
Yeah, for memes. It was for a fundraising effort for Yang memes, which is really cool.
There were some epic deep fakes that came out of that. If you look at
there were
some of the Yang deep fakes on YouTube or on Twitter. You'll find some of the work of Yang DAO, and they're awesome.
Yeah, and they were fun. Like that was the cool thing about Yang DAO. It was like connection than the money, which, you know, Metacartel also had, but Malik DAO, which was the big one in the space, was very much like a whales only kind of DAO. And when Yang DAO came out, it was like, all right, I can spare $40 or 40 DAI and, you know, DAO it.
So then also, I guess the other place we bumped into each other early on was DAO. You want to talk about that one a little bit, and just sort of I mean, it sort of deepens the context of the place where, you know, like political action committees exist, right? The idea of people organizing to give money to the politician they care about is nothing new.
Yeah.
You know,
right.
Yang
Or
DAO's
cause.
sort of an early example of you know, let's get it together behind this cause, but just use the software for the intermediate piece, right? I think DAO is a look at an even deeper version of that.
Yeah, DAO's like a more meta version, I think, in that it's focused on building these decentralized politics tools. Because something we realized early on with our first Peeps product is like normies don't like game theory and a lot of the things that like Web3 people really like. And there aren't like a lot of great tools for decentralizing politics, and even the political tech that does exist is usually focused not on improving the process, but improving the process for a certain political outcome, because it's you know, being funded by either people on the left or people on the right. So to the extent they want to improve kind of voter engagement, they want to improve voter engagement for Republicans or Democrats. And DAO's about kind of like improving political and like government and governance engagement for the sake of improving it, through these like Web3 tools like DAOs and NFTs and different things like that.
So then,
Yeah, that was cool. I got the I voted.
Yeah, POAP. Yeah, and there's like a hackathon coming up in Colorado where I guess you are Deacon and Sam, that's being sponsored by the state, that I think DAO and everybody should participate in. John Poller from Opolis is somehow like involved and getting basically the state and local government there to pay attention to Web3 tools, which is really cool, and you know, a really great opportunity for actually putting what we've built in the hands of like normal people in a state where like people actually vote and live there and want to do stuff and make it better. And it's not just like 100 nerdy white dudes on the internet, which, you know.
Yeah, what's
like,
that hackathon called?
I forget. It's something cool called it, or it's like
Colorado Jam.
Colorado Jam. That's it.
Nice. Have to check it out.
Yeah.
On the face of
I
it, that
feel
could
like we
very
could-
well also be headlined by Fish. Like,
Right. It
having
probably
seen
will be.
zero other branding.
Yeah. I'm sure they'll show up.
Or in a twist for everyone, it could be about, you know, fruit preserves.
Yeah.
The Jams and Jellies Festival. Wow, this is not what I expected in either direction.
Blockchain
Smart
is great
contracts
for-
are immutable because they're jamified, jelly,
Yeah.
preserved.
Preserved. Yeah, it's all connected.
Yeah. Supply chain on the blockchain.
Uh,
Make sure that jam is artisanal. Track it back to the, you know, like goat
Great.
lady that made it.
Goat lady. Oh, I interpreted
what was
that
the chicken's
correctly.
name? Yeah.
Yeah.
Did it live a happy life?
Yeah.
So yeah, the thing I thought like we could talk about in bulk this week is largely the post that you mostly wrote. I helped with a little about sort of more legalistic things, which, you know, you and I as sort of the resident legal background folks inside of HausDAO think about a lot, which for me very practically, like I have a corporate entity from a startup that's kind of in like zombie mode, which is for one, it's a weird thing to explain to people how how you could just sort of be like, well, the software doesn't cost anything to run, so I mean, we don't really have to shut it down. Like, it costs $800 a month to keep the corporate entity alive, and but then constantly, like, the DAO part of my brain is going, ooh, I could decentralize this, and maybe then it gets weird. And yeah, so do you want to, I guess, talk a little bit about the genesis of the post, and then ultimately kind of where the post went?
Yeah.
And from there, I think we can follow it on all how this is, again, like the thing I say frequently, I think but it's doesn't make that any less accurate, is from a lawyer's perspective. We look at a lot of this stuff and we go, oh yeah, we have systems for all this stuff. It's just inefficient as fuck. And so you have to pay lawyers to use it, and that's not fair.
Yeah.
Maybe we can fix that.
There is a lot of that, I'm going to give the little like disclaimer of this is not legal advice, and you should not take legal advice from people on the internet wearing like sweatshirts with flamingos and palm trees.
Jack of clothes.
Yeah.
Sampler there.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the post was focused on kind of this new way of raising or collecting resources, really, because in the traditional startup world, a lot of it is you have 3 categories of stakeholders. You have the kind of employees, founders that create the company, build the product, all of that. You have the investors who give that group of founders the money to do it. And then you have the users who will hopefully eventually pay for it so that the founders can make money from the users, and then the investors can make money from the users. And that dynamic causes a lot of tension because those groups aren't necessarily aligned. I touched on it a little bit in the article, but the VC model is basically, to some extent, spray and pray, depending on how good the VCs are. Even the good VCs are hitting like 2 or 3 home runs in a fund, and then have like 7 kind of like that go to zombie mode or don't really do much. And that means, right, like there are these products that are probably being used and useful to a group of users and have a set of employees and founders that are building them, but they're just not going to turn into like $10 billion companies. And because of the way we do funding companies, at least at this moment in history, that means you lose a lot of value, versus this whole idea of the CCO, I think opens up an alternative to that kind of traditional like venture-backed startup for software companies. Because like since the 70s, if you start a business, you can't go to your bank for a loan. They don't do that anymore. So you're in this weird position where you're like, how do I make enough to live off of and build a company, especially if it is not going to be like the next Facebook or the next Stripe or something? What happens if it becomes a self-sustaining business with 1 million users that really love it, 15 people that have time to put into it, and another 20 people that just love the idea enough to provide other sorts of resources? And here's where the CCO can bring all of those people together and say, look, put your money where your mouth is, or your time where your mouth is, and let's make this thing a self-sustaining thing together. And the trade-off, which I talk about in the article, which is probably like the biggest challenge for a team, I know, like in my mind, being like raised in the traditional kind of like startup capitalist mindset, giving over that much power to kind of your users and your other community is really tough. But at the same time, you create an opening for like a truly aligned that product be successful for the long term and be something that's self-sustaining, and aren't doing it to try and get rich, but are doing it because they're building something of value and participating in something of value. And that's what the article is about. And then it gets into the blocking and tackling, like you were saying, of like, for some projects, that didn't have the foresight to start as like a hackathon project and never incorporate in other stuff. You can get to this point where you have raised a little bit of money and you've got a cap table and you've got an entity, and you're like, shit, this is probably something that should decentralize and become really like a community resource. How do I do that? And the way you do that is you flip it into a DAO, and you make a decision on like how aggressive you want to be in terms of like forward thinking laws of the future, because you can do it in like an ultra decentralized, like, we don't need an entity, we're governed by the internet way, which is really cool. Or if you're a little bit more conservative, you can say like, all right, we'll create an LLC or cooperative structure and have kind of like the certainty that comes with a plain vanilla entity.
So I think before we jump to something else, we should define CCO, which stands for Community Contribution Opportunity.
Right? Yeah. And I think there's an important distinction to make between like the CCO and the ICO and the DAO and all of these other things, because here it's about getting people to contribute resources, which we use that word resources really intentionally. It's not about just like throw money in and we'll build something. It's about like contribute if you have money, some money, if you have time. Like, you could do interesting things around people contributing NFTs or personal tokens to represent their like work or claim on their time. Like, there's not anything stopping a CCO from like not involving ETH or DAI, instead just involving personal tokens or whatnot. It's a much more flexible framework that's focused first on community and creating in collecting the resources you need to sustain the product.
And I think the crazy thing is when you try to explain just the broader notion of CCO and how it's sort of different from these other sort of offering, where the O stands for offering kind of opportunities, right? Like, the point is to bring capital or resources or human capital into a project ultimately. But like, the thing I enjoyed as HausDAO was starting up was essentially like, our point is just to spend the money, and then we're going to tie this sort of secondary bootstrapping of a tokenized system to our efficacy in spending the money to build the product like we said we were going to. It might just end up that the house token is nothing but a thing I carry on in my wallet for the rest of my life to show youngs that I was there for an OG project, that they're, that they like, because partially open source is weird this way, because like, we can't do the same things that Facebook would do to monetize in order to be as a community platform. Just because of open source. But it also just kind of like fundamentally breaks the VC system in a way, because I mean, there's the thing I realized in my last sort of venture in having pursuing VC funding, like, they have a timeline. They have spreadsheets based on a timeline, and they are based on you making it to the next step in your growth like trajectory. And so the first VCs in they don't necessarily care about the product. They care about, okay, the value of these shares that you just gave me an agreement for is pegged to their price when you get to this next step. And so all they care about is get to that next step and make it as big as possible. And so sometimes you have these things that seem like a good idea, like WeWork, that get off the launch pad before people have kind of like run the numbers on what the real estate picture of WeWork actually looks like. And then you get the flame out that WeWork had, because people go, wait a minute, they shouldn't have made it to the 5th round of this cycle, but they did because the hype is such, and now that system, like that's an example of a failure of that system. But they also failed to fund public goods, which is what I was fighting against in the legal space. Like, I can't grow a competent legal tech startup fast enough to just match the VC's books. Like, it doesn't even have anything to do with vision. They have to be able to sit tight for a 20-year project if I'm going to go fix a public system like the judicial system.
Yeah,
and
I
that's
think
why it ends up handled by nonprofits, right? Where they're willing to just throw money at something because people said, you should throw money at this problem. Go.
Also, the thing you get as kind of an open source developer is you have a project and you have community members that are contributing in some way by either developing or using the project. You get a lot of just straight up users that need support, and it starts from a project that was a lot just like fun to do with you and your buddies to becoming like, okay, well, people are using this for real and they need support and they need us to fix these bugs and they need more people working on it. And so it's really hard to transfer an open source project from something that is just like a weekend fun project to something that actually is something that is serious and has to be maintained.
Yeah, I think that's the probably challenge that like DAOhaus and HausDAO faced more, which I like from my perspective, and I wasn't in it as early as like Deacon and Ven and Sam that built the original. It seems to be going pretty well for HausDAO, where it's done a good job of kind of like moving beyond having 3 people work on it to now having like 15 people work on it. And that transition happened a lot because of the CCO and having a way to kind of organize the incentives and get everybody kind of like bought in one way, shape, or form. And yeah, unlike the VCs, like people aren't buying in with the expectation of, like I'm buying in, I expect in 12 months that my investment will have doubled. I expect in another 12 months that it'll have gone 4x and on, right? Because that's how you get the WeWorks, or like my favorite examples, like the Juicero, where raised $70 million before people realized like you could squeeze the bags. And yeah, like, it just seems like a better system because it's very developer and user working together driven than, like the traditional like Facebook type startup. It's very developer founder driven, and it's much more about like how can Mark Zuckerberg extract as much money from his users so that he can then give it to his investors and himself.
I'm curious. This is sort of it's a unrelated question-ish, and it relates to a thing we left out in your intro, Bill. But you're also an advisor with Duke's startup lab. Is that legal tech specific stuff?
Yeah, it's the Duke Law Tech Lab. Yeah, I started that when I was a student, and was lucky enough to like rope in a professor that got stuck doing it essentially because the first time went pretty well, and now he has to do it as part of his job, which is hilarious.
I'm curious where, and this is a thing I bring up every time that you and I catch up kind of one-on-one. Like, I'm always curious what you're seeing in terms of the projects that flow through that kind of space, right? Because like I was saying, the things in legal tech move a lot slower. They're a lot more Web 2, sort of approaches to solving the problems, but they all kind of live at this same space where like I end up going, oh, a DAO would be good for that, but I don't know that the users they're talking about are ready to for me to try to explain to them what a crypto DAO is.
And one of the cool things about the Duke Law Tech Lab and is really a credit to the professor who took it over after I graduated, is that it's become very access to justice focused. So it really bumps into that issue of all of the good of people. They're not just kind of like document review software or ways of extracting data from people and selling it to big corporations. These are applications that are helping people kind of like fight landlord tenant disputes on their own, or handle like non-contested divorces on their own at a tenth the price they would otherwise. And the interesting thing that we've seen from the journey there is the startups that are most successful in that space tend to be much more direct to consumer. And there really is this desire for people to be able to solve kind of their own problems and cut out lawyers. And like people have figured out that selling to lawyers and law firms and trying to kind of like sell to the system and make marginal improvements on how it works is a really bad strategy, because the sales cycle takes forever. A big law partner, and I've talked to big law partners quite a bit in the context of this legal tech stuff, right? They're not incentivized to bring like 10% efficiency unless a client like really demands it, because they make more money off of things being like slightly less efficient.
By the hour. Doing things slow is literally incentivized in the system.
Yeah,
it just is. That's it. The thing we used to say with Juris, my other company, was like billable hours don't scale. Like you can't scale the system because you run out of human hours. And the extent to which it's failing the public is really remarkable. Like 80% of people that should be getting help here can't get it.
Right.
The problem is no, go ahead.
Well, the thing is, like, law firms really try to scale that billable hours. I've been a part of that, where they will try and squeeze a lot of billable hours out of you. And they've become much more pyramid shaped, where you have like the rainmaker and then a lot of different people working for that person in order to kind of push profits up.
We should talk about that for a second. The idea of the rainmaker is a really fun thing to explain to non-law firm people.
Yeah.
I mean, there's like a John Grisham book called The Rainmaker, right?
Yeah.
I think Matt Damon was in the movie.
Yeah. And the rainmaker is essentially the guy, and usually, unfortunately, it is a guy who brings in the clients and comes in and like shakes hands and is usually incredibly like charismatic. It's much more like a salesperson that knows a little bit about law. Mm-hmm. And then that person hands it off to all of the kind of like nerdy, not as good with people person, or people that do all of the actual work. And that, rainmaker really just is the client relations and kind of like project manager to some extent.
It's just a very interesting, I mean, and these are well-paid things, right? So if you're a rainmaker at a big firm in New York, you spend most of your time in saunas and on racquetball courts and make $1 million a year. It's bananas.
Oh, it's not $1 million a year. It's in the tens of millions of dollars a year.
I'm trying to be generous to the rainmakers.
Yeah.
So they don't seem too much like the moneyed elite shitheads.
Yeah. No, they definitely are the moneyed
how it
elite.
filters out in some places.
Yeah.
So
right, and
so
yeah, that the end result of that system is you're right. It just fails like 80% of people.
Right. I mean, like, and I'm not just making that up the way I was making up $1 million-ish, right? Like the American Bar Association does studies on this, and they go, "Yep, only 22% of demand is met for legal help."
Mm-hmm.
So like they are actively failing to scale. At the same time, to attack something like access to justice, you have to charge like $2 or $3. Like you have to price your thing like it would be available at 7-Eleven, and so you're taking to the VCs this idea that like, here's this volume we could generate if we take this thing that's previously cost $2,000 and price it at $2. And they go, we don't like the math on that, and they back away from it slowly. And so these really solid public good projects have a hard time getting funded because like it just to get the escape velocity for the $2 a pop product working is you can't. It becomes a volume problem, like in a different direction, because you need to get to enough people, and so then you end up on this sort of public infrastructure, like nonprofits and university piggybacks and like this is where we get to the DAO piece, right? Because if you could have community ownership of those types of efforts, like this is where this stuff hits open source and DAOs, right? So,
yep, exactly, yeah, and that was something we saw. Interestingly, with the Duke Law Tech Lab, the things that would get funded after they went through us tended to be the things that would take a $50,000 project and turn it into like a $5,000. So it was like, well, these things aren't really affordable or available to the middle class, and this app makes it available to the middle class, and that's what people are interested in funding, because you don't have to hit like that escape velocity of 100 million uses for it to be interesting to a VC. Versus, yeah, you're right, like there is this big space between legal aid and like nonprofits and these like kind of more middle class legal problem focused apps that could really be served by doing some sort of like community contribution opportunity.
If I were really slick, I would use this as an opportunity to launch my community contribution opportunity.
Yeah, you should have.
I'm not there yet. I blew it. Don't hire me for digital strategy.
Yeah,
he says to the group of people that pay him to do digital strategy.
Yeah, I mean, that was something also in the article that you have to think it through, and that was like the DAOhaus strategy and CCO. One, it's in a way still ongoing because we're learning as we do it, and a couple months of planning went into it, and DAOhaus had again the advantage of not being an existing entity with a cap table and everything. It started as an open source project, versus if you have a cap table and like in some small investors and employees and stuff, like you've got to talk it through with those people and make sure that they're on board for this like radical restructuring of how the project works. You can't just like force it on people.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, I guess, like, and yeah, taking the example of like with an existing cap table of employees and investors and founders, right? Those are the only ones at the table that currently we need to like deal with that. Users aren't really a part of that yet.
No.
Because it's not a CEO or anything. So you have to deal with their incentives. And the employees actually probably would be the lowest friction, because you're giving them more power than they had before. Like that's like, I mean, to me, the biggest thing, I think it was like, I can't remember who it was on Twitter the other day. They were like, hiring is like the hardest thing. It's harder than raising money or something. And I was like, have you tried giving power away with money? That's what it's about, right? Like, I mean, we're all just here together. We all have power. Everybody has like a really strong voice, and can make things and can change whatever they want. So, and I think that's a big selling point, I think, to the employees. The investors, I think, are the ones that are the hard sell. But I think to your point, it's like by distributing power and voice to all participants in the thing, including users, eventually, like the thing just gets better because everybody's there and has insight. You don't need like some like magic CEO with like all the answers, because it doesn't exist. They're usually just a sociopath who knows people with money. Like that's the reality of the CEO. They're not actually good at anything except being like sociopathic, charismatic, and getting money, right? So like you need other people to like actually have voice and things. So it changes that dynamic greatly, and it depends on what you're doing for sure. But if it's I feel like if it's a thing that could use more voice, if it is just a thing where there's like 1 or 3 people who are driving it, then it's probably not a thing for you, right? But if it's a thing where like that can benefit from a diverse group of voices to make it better, and to just people work together to build it into like a sustainable thing, then yeah, it's a really great option, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think so many projects like fall into that category, many more than in
Yeah, I
the
think so
early
too.
stages of tech, which is where blockchain is. Yeah, like
Well,
despite all of the DeFi madness, I feel like there's still probably like 10,000 people in the world that are actual like blockchain DApp users.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's the place where the analogy of the early internet sort of like works. And
Yeah.
I generally don't like it because I think it doesn't account for the acceleration that we're living through, which is a completely different sort of systemic conversation. But like, when you're solving protocol level problems, they have to be open source because we're literally making up the grammar of the like communication protocol that we're using to optimize a thing. And if somebody wants to say, yeah, but our version of SMTP charges 0.0 cent, like a fraction of a penny, at that time in trying to get this tech to work, like that wouldn't have been adopted. And so SMTP only works. Email is only as ubiquitous as it is because nobody gets to monetize the communication protocol, right?
Right. Yeah. You just have somebody that monetized the content and the data they can extract from it.
Right.
And so then we kind of have this thing where it's like these
awesome.
really high value things are generated, but if they're not started by academia or whatever, then you end up with SSL being maintained by, this small nonprofit that like can't fix it fast enough for the fact that it's the encryption standard for all the banks, which is bananas.
Right. And that's why, so many, that's also why I think this is a better route for open source projects than kind of the traditional like Linux Foundation or Rust Foundation model. Because like you said, what ends up happening is you have academia or a nonprofit or government develop a new protocol or standard. A bunch of corporations figure out that the standard's really good for them and start to rely on it. And then somebody at like the nonprofit or in the academia or in the foundations like, we need money. And so the corporations start like kicking in money and dev time, which just means like, that project is naturally going to favor the needs of that corporation. I think, right, like something like Red Hat, which is probably the most successful kind of like open source focused company, you have to imagine that like Linux really, as it developed, kind of like served the needs of Red Hat more than probably like man or woman in their basements trying to like work on a Linux kernel, because Red Hat had so much kind of like economically invested in Linux working a certain way so that it could implement it and get paid for, working on top of this open source protocol by its customers.
The funny thing is, if you bring that up as the example for how this can work in a VC meeting, they'll immediately answer with the canned response, which is, that has worked exactly once. Which is, I don't know that that's strictly true to begin with.
No.
But also, like, yeah, but there's new things now that are the coordination. Like, this is what we're talking about with DAOs, right? Like, we have new coordination tools that completely change that. Like, the new coordination tool that made Linux work was Git and email, which at the time were like new things, and we built something really cool with it. But now we have these other new things. It's what we're here to be stoked
and like
about fundamentally, I think.
I mean, GitHub wasn't open source, but it was really like a public good, and they found an obviously good exit. And then, there are also all these, like, people forget that you can rebuild Facebook, like the interface, the user piece of Facebook or the user piece of Twitter in like a weekend if you're a decent dev, right? There's nothing special about like a news feed and like the create, read, update, delete stuff that's just like the core of Facebook. obviously they've monetized all the people that used it really well with proprietary software. But their value comes from like people using a site that could be like Facebook and Twitter get their value from network effects. And I think that's what we're going to discover long term, is that like network effects are the greatest competitive moat that you can have. And they're in some ways like really the only competitive moat, because you're always going to get outbuilt by some like scrappy tech genius, or a Microsoft that can pay a scrappy tech genius, $50 million to build technology that's marginally better than yours. What you can't do is get a million people or a billion people who really love your product and use it to like communicate and coordinate every day with others. And Facebook's just done that in like a highly extractive way, versus something like DAOhaus is in essence building something similar that's just like non-extractive. And that's where I think like long term this probably has the potential to supplant those Web 2 apps, because it offers the same level of connections. It offers it in a much deeper level. It can become an essential kind of coordination tool. And then once there's the network effects on like DAO platforms, it's going to be really hard to compete with that, because like users are the hardest thing to get.
Yeah, the fundamental thing that caused my shift to like sort of, oh yeah, this is how blockchains work and how they mesh with everything was Naval Ravikant has a tweet storm I refer to all the time where he explains how blockchains allow networks to behave like markets. And I read that thing and I went, oh, okay. And I got to exactly the point that you just got to, which is, I don't know the pace exactly yet, but the value that Facebook is currently selling ads into is going to be decimated by this technology eventually, because it'll give that value to me instead of to the shareholders of Facebook, of which I am one. So I mean, in a sense, I'm getting the money. But increasingly, owning Facebook makes me feel like I own the stock of a cigarette company or something. Like it's the model did not. At 10 years in, they broke democracy. That's a problematic for me. Like
I mean, I feel the same way. I don't directly own any Facebook stock, but being somebody who grew up in tobacco country, I'm like, I probably would rather own like Altria stock than Facebook, because with Altria, you know what you're getting into when you like smoke a pack of cigarettes. Facebook, you don't realize like how bad it is.
So we need like Surgeon General warnings for the corner of the Facebook interface.
Right. Yeah. And they're kind of starting to do that with their like warnings about misleading content. It's like, this might brainwash you and you might find yourself a member of a right-wing militia if you're not careful.
So another quick topic, I guess, but kind of the same, talking about Moloch and governance and how these things change. One of your other projects is Pool Party. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sorry. How did we miss Pool Party?
Yeah, thank you, Deacon, for reminding me to pull my own product. Yeah. So, I mean, Pool Party is just another DAO platform. So it's built off of Moloch DAOs. And the way it differs from the Moloch DAOs that you might launch in other places is that it automatically takes the funds that would sit in the DAO and puts them into a DeFi platform. Because, we realized that a lot of DAOs, end up saving up funds to kind of go accomplish their goal later. And we were like, that's awesome. It's a little bit like Kickstarter in its early days. But there's this thing called DeFi where you could put that money and earn what are still like relatively absurdly high amounts of interest on it. So, we've basically just automated that. And then our DAOs are a little bit more goal focused. It's a slightly more kind of like niche, or I don't know if niche is the right word, but it's like a subset of a Moloch. It's one of the many. Yeah, it's one of the many iterations of the Moloch. Focus much more on like goal-based community savings for products or property or whatever, hacker villas in Cartagena next summer.
Yeah, vacations.
So yeah, and we're really excited, and we've also kind of like to show open source more. We've built it to be interoperable with kind of the boosts that DAOhaus are developing, and hopefully be discoverable on DAOhaus once we get our subgraph working with other DAO types a little bit better. And that's another thing that just like excites me about this world and the open source approach is you can build stuff in a way where it is like a rising tide lifts all boats, and people can be highly incentivized to work together, because to the extent that DAOhaus is successful, like that helps Pool Party potentially be more successful, because it's like normalizing DAOs and creating apps and add additional features for DAOs, and that's what I love most about this ecosystem.
That's a perfect segue into the last bit to round out, although we've in 3 minutes, so I don't know how much of a boost bash we can do. I think ultimately maybe the boost bash is just to tease the idea that there's no reason a CCO mechanism couldn't be turned on with the flip of a switch for a DAO that wanted to use it as a way to,
and that's something we're building.
Not raise money, but
figure it out. Go through that process of kind of decentralizing in a very intentional way to bring in community. Mm-hmm. And so we're building Boost for that, mostly because we have to build the technology for us to use it. And so why not just build it in a productizable way?
Dog food.
Yeah. And I think like the hardest part of the CCO process should be like the decision making and the community discussions. And then once you're ready to execute on it, it should be like, type in this, click this button, done.
We pressed the button. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. It's the last thing. We have an audience question that maybe is a place to round it out. Again, it feels like way too technical for 2 minutes. So anyway, that has to dip at an hour. We've hit the hour. Thanks for watching.
Yeah.
Like and subscribe on YouTube, etc. We'll end on this question, and if it bleeds over a little, then hang out. But we'll take off after that.
Wait, hold on. Before we get to the audience question, another boost would be sweet. Maybe is like to have DAOs like spin up pool parties for various purposes. That's kind of like I was just thinking about the need for DAOs to there's many different initiatives going on. Like Metacartel is like pooling some ETH together to have a staking stake, things like that. So these little side pools, that'd be
absolutely. We're actually talking with like Yaler and some of the other Metacartel people about using a pool party for the ETH mini stake stuff, and that is a great example of where it'll be a pool party that's essentially like controlled by another DAO or affiliated with another DAO. And I think that's something we're going to see a lot of, is like DAO on DAO action, and people like using like the pool parties, which have a more specific purpose within the like umbrella of a DAO like Metacartel that might have a more generalized purpose. And that's just another example of like the stronger this ecosystem gets, the better it is for everybody.
Cool. So then the audience question from Spencer, who's actually here now. So I feel like we could do this radio show style and you could ask it, Spencer, or otherwise I can read it, but you let me know.
I'm happy to lend my voice to the words. That was so pretentious. Sorry. So my question was back when you're talking about public goods and how communities have a little bit of an incentive to keep goods going. It's a little bit of a selfish question because I'm working on two things that are involved in the question. So thing number one is a DAO that is doing or has done a CCO and is kind of sort of trying to decentralize in that way. And then the other thing, I'm also helping on a new quadratic funding protocol, ClearFund.
Oh, cool.
That's the reason for my question is like, I sort of wonder if is there anything that you, Bill, or I guess anybody else on the line sees as an opportunity for DAOs using a CCO process to use quadratic funding in some way, or to try to get contributions via quadratic funding? Very much an open-ended question. I've just along the lines of public goods, both of those things are geared towards that same goal. So I'm wondering if there's a connection point.
Yep. So had to bring on my special guest. Yeah, I feel like quadratic funding is another kind of great coordination mechanism that fights against kind of that like formerly whale-focused wealthy people control the narrative and everything, and you know, it could absolutely be a part of the CCO process. Both you could do quadratic voting, and I feel like in organizing how the community spends its funds, you could do quadratic funding for, right, like the sub projects or sub pieces that need to get built.
Or yeah, just even as just like a type of vote or whatever, just to like, you know, these are some options, and then allow like the community to like quadratically choose those or whatever.
So you got your beautiful little baby there.
When baby
I was
down.
thinking about this the other day because I'm about to have one too, and so setting up a DAO for your kid, is it like immoral or like doing a fundraising around a baby?
We have thought about that, like doing a DAOified college fund. He has an ENS address, at least to get him started. But I love that idea, like a DAO college fund or a DAO for him. Get all the grandparents onboarded to crypto.
How can you do? I was thinking about this in the context of sort of the URL thing the other day, because I also have a newborn baby, and I was immediately like, same thing. I should buy the URL. And I got to hold on to this domain now. Like, GoDaddy's making good money off of me every year. Like, why can't I put that value somewhere else and put it to work in the, I don't know, 12 to 18 years before he cares?
Let's the three of us start a DAO
Yeah.
for our babies, and then we'll start a index fund around each of our babies.
Yeah,
and
right. Later we can all say, if we had bought
commit their
Berkshire
first
Hathaway.
I'm not sure your baby should trust you with their private keys, though.
Yeah.
It's going to become their identity of the future.
We'll commit their first paychecks to the DAO so that people have some
There we go. ISAs.
Do like a social token offering for the babies.
Right.
Yeah, the DAO.
Brings new meaning to parent DAO and child DAO.
Yeah, I know.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. He says okay.
Anyway, I feel like that's a pretty good place to wrap up. Thanks for hanging out, Bill, and everybody else.
Of course.
And to the
Thanks,
rest
Bill.
of the party people watching, listening
Talk to
on
you guys
YouTube
later.
or otherwise, like and subscribe. We'll keep this stuff coming.
Already on, y'all.